Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and I'm joined today by Seth Hart, who is a new contributor on the CC blog. But today we're just going to talk about a whole lot of stuff. There's not really a whole lot of structure to this interview. I just want to talk to Seth about what are we talking about today?
We talked about doing talks about PhD work in academia.
Yes, all the things.
Quite a few other things. Just what's going on with CC recently, the blogs I'm doing, all that.
So, yeah, we're going to talk about Smash. We're going to talk about PhD work. We're going to talk about some of the things that you're currently working on. I'm trying to figure out what we want to talk about first. Why don't we do PhD?
Sure.
Okay, because you're in the middle of getting a PhD, and so tell me what that experience has been like, and then I also want to let the audience, or sort of let the audience in to the whole world of getting a PhD. What does that actually look like? You know, because it doesn't, I mean, I learned some things when you and I talked that I just had no idea was a thing, you know? So let's get into it. So what kind of PhD program are you in, and why did you want to pursue that?
Yeah, so I came out of my master's at Oxford. I was doing, working with Alistair McGrath in science and religion. It was a great work. I was a Clarendon scholar there, so it's the only way I could go. So funding is a big deal when it comes to overseas work. And so when it comes to a PhD, the biggest advice I got is from one of the professors at Oxford named Ashley Moyse, who works in science and religion. He said, never pay for a PhD if you don't have to, unless you're just swimming in wealth. So taking that advice, that's kind of a difficult decision to make, because then you're either committed to going to the US, which is anywhere from 5 to 7 year commitment, but they are fully funded. They usually have about $20,000 a year plus health insurance and a few other benefits, perks that go with it. Or you're going to the UK, which is only 3 years, which is quite nice. But then it becomes a lot more difficult, because normally, especially as an overseas student, you're paying about $20,000 per year.
Yeah, which still doesn't seem like too much. I mean, it's still expensive, you know. Mm-hmm. $20,000 is not just like chump change, but nevertheless, it does seem like, my impression of a PhD program was that you'd be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, like maybe even every year. But my impression just, wasn't really based on anything. So
yeah, it's that, plus, I mean, when you're doing a full-time PhD work, you have lost revenue with, you usually can't work simultaneous to it.
Okay.
They don't want you. In fact, most visas say you can only work X number of hours. So when you add in that fact, it does end up becoming hundreds of thousands of dollars, even if you're making, just a sort of middle wage job. It ends up cutting into it. So you really have to save up quite a bit, because then you add in a lot living fees without working, and living overseas is quite expensive. Mm-hmm. So when it all comes to it, it's quite an expensive venture unless you have funding.
So then what is your PhD, like what is your thesis on?
So my thesis, I'm looking at biology and the language of purpose, goals, and ends. I think for the audience of CC, they might be most familiar with the work of Alvin Plantinga. And Alvin Plantinga wrote a book a while back. It's not really one of his more discussed works, called Warrant and Proper Function. And in the work, it's nearly a forgotten apologetic argument. He talks about how in biology, we talk about things having proper functions. For instance, a heart is for pumping blood. Hearts do a lot of other things. They make a thump-thump noise. But that's not what they're for. And Alvin Plantinga asked the question, well, why can we talk about that in biology? Why do things have purposes? Biologists can ask, what's a thing for? But geologists don't do that. Physicists don't do that. They don't ask what an atom is for, what a planet is for, what a rock is for. Only biologists get to talk about purposes. So what justifies that? Where do purposes come from? If atoms don't have purposes, how do you, when you collect enough atoms, put them in the right order, does a purpose somehow pop out of existence, or pop into existence?
Pop into being.
Pop into being, exactly.
As Dr. Craig would say.
Yeah, exactly. in his unique way. So I'm looking at that, and Plantinga arrived at a very theistic conclusion with that, and it's a very live topic in the philosophy of biology. It's one of, just a few years ago, it was declared the hottest topic in the philosophy of biology. How do we deal with teleology in the biological sphere? And it seems
like these organs have like a function, way that they're supposed to operate.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because when we think about teleology and biology and related to apologetics, we normally think of intelligent design theory.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a sort of backdoor in because it's not necessarily in conflict with evolutionary science, with Darwinism, with the modern synthesis. And yet it still seems, in fact, Darwinism itself seems to presuppose it in the fact that adaptations seem to be adapted for certain functions. Why did one bird survive and another bird didn't? Well, the wings were better adapted for flying or for some sort of survival purpose. So really it's sort of built into the very logic of Darwinism itself. So I'm looking at that and I'm trying to build an apologetic case from that.
Was there some what was your master's in? Remind me, what was it? Was it in a related subject or was it?
Yeah, so my master's work was basically giving an outline of that.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I thought it was on something unrelated. I thought it was like theology or something, or maybe you're working on that science and theology like later on, or.
Yeah, so it is science and theology. Yeah.
Okay. So that's like the general umbrella of like what it's about.
Mm-hmm. It's technically a theology degree, though it deals in philosophy of science because my conclusion is therefore God exists.
Yeah. Well, I think of it more just like philosophy. Like it just seems like a real, obvious philosophical argument. That you would want to make there. Yeah. So I mean, so theology, it kind of falls under that. But when I think of theology, I think of like New Testament studies and Old Testament, and archaeology and stuff like that. It's like that to me is what theology is, but it's probably not that important.
I'll let you know a little secret in academia.
Okay.
Most biblical studies scholars hate being called theologians. They strongly distinguish themselves from that.
Why?
They don't like the term because what they think of themselves as doing is more scientific, whereas theology is more philosophical.
Uh-huh.
And so most of my New Testament friends, they'll say, I'm not a theologian. They don't want to get into that. They say, all I'm doing is interpreting the text through the lens of historical studies, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So they see themselves closer to an historian than they do a theologian. But even though they usually are in the same department, I will say that.
Yeah.
But so there is a sort of there is a sort of strong sort of line drawn between what you were saying, archaeologists, and what theologians, I should say, theologians proper do, which is far more philosophical quite often.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the couple blog posts that you've done on the Capturing Christianity website. If you guys haven't read them, you need to read them immediately, by the way. So these blog posts, you've done 2 blog posts so far. We've got some others in the works. And so hopefully we're going to turn this into like a fairly consistent thing on the website. So if you guys haven't been to capturingchristianity.com, you need to go over there and check it out. We also have a free book. I don't really mention this enough. We have a free book. It's a 60-page ebook on the rationality of Christian belief. And you can get that free if you sign up for our email list and whatever. So it's completely free. You don't have to pay anything for it. If you need to just go to the website, capturingchristianity.com, you can get a hold of that. But let's talk about the blog post and what was the genesis of the blog post. And we're talking about kind of the genesis of evolution. I love using these terms together. So yeah, the genesis of evolution and how, and around that time, what was the church's reaction? Was it negative? Was it positive? I mean, because the culture, what we're sort of taught to believe, and maybe it's just like it stems out of the fact that there are Christians who are against evolution these days, and that's kind of like the majority thing that you see in America, at least, is that all of these Christians are railing against it. They don't want it to be true. They don't want it to be taught in schools. They want their view to be taught, creationism or whatever label you want to put on it. But back in the day, so that's a separate question though, from like, what was the church's response to Darwin back in the 1800s, right? And that's what your 2 blog posts are about. But tell me a little about the backstory of like, why was that a subject that interested you?
Yeah, so I mean, like a lot of Christians growing up in North America, I grew up hearing that young earth creationism was the Christian doctrine, not just a Christian. It was the foundation, it was the rock upon which the other doctrines were sort of embedded. And being a kid who was very interested in science, I obviously had to wrestle with that. And just going through studies, I began to realize how difficult and sort of my faith had a near crisis, in the sense that I always felt like it was sort of on edge, that I was one evidence or one proof or one discovery of a missing link away from having to abandon the thing that had been a bedrock in my life. And that wasn't a good place for my faith to be. And thank goodness I began to sort of do research and try to figure it out, and slowly come to discover not only was Christianity compatible with evolution, and as my thesis will prove, I think theism is more compatible with Darwinism than atheism. But that historically, this sort of conflict, and this arose just out of my graduate studies, just looking into this, and was shocked and realized this word needed to get out, is that the arrival of this modern idea, it's a completely contemporary idea that young earth creationism has been a bedrock of the Christian faith throughout history. Yeah, and you asked about the 19th century reaction to Darwinism. What was shocking to me is, I think if for people looking for recommendations, I would recommend Ronald Numbers and David Livingstone, who were probably the two best historians.
You can look right into the lens if you want to talk to the audience.
Gotcha. Ronald Numbers and David Livingstone. Those are the two best if you're looking for good, short, but good, well-written scholarly texts. Those would be the two I would recommend. And what they do, one's a Christian, one is very much not a Christian. So they're not coming at this, not necessarily coming at this from an apologetic angle. Is they're looking at how did Christians initially react to this? And what they found was, shockingly enough, is that Christians had already come to terms with an idea of an old earth. They were very much on board early on with Darwin's ideas. They saw it as a sort of bulwark and a sort of counter-argument against some of the other evolutionary ideas like Lamarckianism that were coming out, that were used, that were more hostile to Christian faith. They saw, so for instance, Asa Gray, the man who brought Darwinism to America, saw apologetic value in Darwinism. And I believe Rope, who's also been on your channel, is trying to resurrect that design argument from evolutionary studies that sort of existed in seed form in Asa Gray's argument. But that wasn't uncommon. Christians, the book by David Livingstone is called Darwin's Forgotten Defenders. Christians early on were radically in favor of Darwin's theory, especially compared to today.
Yeah, why is that important though to focus on? Why should we care that the early church was for it? Because this is one of the objections that I got, or that I've been seeing in the comments, and I've seen when I would post the blog post anywhere, is that okay, even if the church was pro Darwinism, or their reaction wasn't any different than the broader scientific community, even if all of that's true, it doesn't negate the fact that the Christian church today is very opposed to evolution and Darwinism, right? And so that's still a problem. We haven't solved really anything. This is just kind of a historical point that's kind of interesting, but it's not that interesting because the bigger problem remains.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points there.
Okay.
The first one is there's an atheist line of attack, which is, and it's been debunked quite a few times by too many scholars, which is called the conflict myth, which is Christians have always been a sort of wall to scientific progress, that scientists had to chip away slowly the Christian edifice to build us up. As far as that goes, Christians should not let should not let atheists get away with that. Excuse me. Should not let atheists get away with that. Darwinism was initially accepted. If anything, it was promoted by Christians as much as it was within the scientific community itself. So they were right on board with the scientific ideas at the time. So number one, it sort of pops that bubble that sort of takes the steam out of the argument of that atheistic attack. And I think even young earth creationists can get on board with that. Even if they think those Christians were wrong, they don't let the atheists get away with that. I think the second big point is the idea that if this has been foundational to Christian belief, and always has been, and Darwinism has been this sort of atheistic sort of onslaught against it, a tool of atheism, why weren't Christians so hostile to this when it first came out? When the scientific evidence was at its infancy, Christians were already jumping on board Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory had a lot of problems initially, and the scientific community didn't really embrace it for another 50, 60 years before Darwinism really gained an acceptance from the scientific community in any large degree. And yet Christians were already jumping on board with this. I think that begins to undermine, it gives lie to the fact that this literal 7-day creation view has always been foundational to the Christian theory. I think it shows that Christians for a long time, and you can look at this going back to Augustine, going back to Origen, or in early Christianity, that Christians have not always been of this opinion. In fact, Do you know what number of the early church fathers did not believe the days of Genesis were literal?
Do I know what number?
Yeah, percentage-wise.
Percentages, okay. No, I mean, I thought that, because I've only really heard that, was it Augustine, who has the sort of the view that the 7 days were not literal, right? There was like figurative or whatever, but
yeah.
Other than that, I don't know. So,
Organ as well. It's somewhere between 30 to 40%.
That they did not believe.
Did not. That we know for sure that they did not. And I'm taking this from a young earth creationist count. Jonathan Sarfati, in his book, Refuting Compromise, did this count. So this has been a live debate since the church began. Philo of Alexandria, who predates and sort of was contemporary with the founding of the church, Jesus' contemporary, he didn't believe in a literal 6-day creation. So, I mean, this has been part of Christianity since Christianity began.
Yeah. I'm still thinking about that objection that, like, it's still a problem today, you know? So even if the conflict thesis is false and, yeah, so it still seems like there's still a problem. So what would you do? What would you say to the atheist who's like, well, still there's this problem. You got Ken Ham building these arcs and stuff, and it's like they're still teaching, you know, young earth creationism, and it's very prominent in the American church. So what would you say in response to like that specific problem?
Yeah, I would say that this is the way you get around it, right? Because recent studies shows a slight decline in the number, slight decline in the sort of hostility of Christians toward evolutionary theory, which is
contemporary
nice.
Christians.
Contemporary Christians, yeah. So it seems that with millennials, Gen Zs, that we're slowly coming to embrace what Christians initially did. So that young earth creationism seems to be on the rise. It had a huge birth going into the 50s and 60s, and it now seems to be sort of on its way out. That seems to be the general trend that's going on. But it has been because of things like this. So for the atheist who says this is a huge problem, well, it's not going to be the atheist who convinces Christians, because most of the atheists agree with young earth creationists that there is this conflict, right? So it's funny. It's Richard Dawkins and Ken Ham are very much in agreement that Genesis and science are in conflict. It's going to be people like Francis Collins. It's going to be people like Joshua Swamidath, who are actively working to show, no, we don't have to abandon Christian doctrine. Yeah,
that's very true. There are a lot of similarities between atheists and young earth creationists, especially when it concerns, you know, these texts in Genesis and whatnot. Okay, maybe it's time to, well, I'll let the audience know one more time. So if you haven't gone to the website, go to the website, read those 2 blog posts, and just get more familiarized with the website and all the cool stuff that's there. So let's switch gears again. And I wanted to talk about, like, we had a lot of fun last night. And what we did last night was we played Super Smash Brothers together. And so this is something that I do in my free time. I play with my brother the atheist, who like spawned this whole journey and this whole thing. Pretty much, he and I play Super Smash Brothers pretty frequently, and we really enjoy it. It's a bonding thing that we do. So, anyways, but last night we were talking just about general stuff, and then we got on the topic of video games, and then I learned that you play Super Smash, and I also learned that you main King K. Rool. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, it was a lot of fun last night.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. You mixed it up. I pretty much stuck with K. Rool, though.
You went between K. Rool and then Link. So you did play some Link. Did you play anyone else? Or was that it?
That was it.
Those 2. Okay. I hopped around all over the place. I started with Little Mac. Then I think I went to Byleth, I think. I jumped
Robin, and then,
Robin eventually. Jigglypuff. Yeah, Jigglypuff. She's been my main lately.
Yeah.
She's hard to learn, though. She's like, because she's so floaty. Like, you start to, with the other characters, you kind of get used to like just the 2 jumps, right? You get the 1 hop, and then you get the 2nd jump, and like that's it.
The B, and then you're done.
Exactly. Yeah. And with her, you know, it's just really weird.
Her range, you really have to learn because you're such in control of it.
Yeah. You're. I mean, there's 2 ways in which the range is important. So like, she can float and go anywhere in the map, but also her like attacks are just very small.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like any kind of sword character can get close to her. I hope you guys aren't getting too bored of this if you don't play this game. But another thing on the topic of video games I learned about you is that you played Halo 3 competitively.
Yeah.
And as a huge Halo fan, man, I was playing Halo 1 with my friends when it first came out. Halo 2, that was probably like the game for me. The BXR, do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Yeah, the BXR, that was I had that down, and I was very good at that game. Yeah, I was super good at that game. And then Halo 3, I didn't really get into as much because it didn't feel like the same game. But that's the game. Halo 3 is the one that you actually played it competitively. Mm-hmm. Did you win tournaments? What did you, I don't know if I asked enough questions about this last night. But what did that actually, you say you played competitively, what was that actually like?
Yeah, I played a few tournaments. I usually ended up middle of the road. I was the best in my school, high school, which was always my claim to fame. But competitively, I was always sort of mid-tier.
Okay.
Online, though, I did a lot better. That was usually the training ground.
Yeah, and I mean, when you go to a tournament, it's like nothing but like the top players, right? And that's like the whole point of a tournament, right? Is to like compete and try to be the best. But online, it's like you've got casuals, you've got some really good players, but then you've got people like you who are mid-tier, and you can still do really well.
Yeah,
right?
It never became sort of the people who did super well or the people who sort of obsessed about it, and that never could completely become my life. So yeah. I always realized that if I really wanted to become the best, I had to start memorizing spawn points. And timing weapons, because these got competitive players, they have all of this in the back of their head.
Yeah, and they're looking at the timer when it like hits this time when they pick up a gun and stuff.
It was always the worst when you played against the people who had a grenade waiting for you when you spawned.
Oh,
so
my
those were the absolute worst. So that's why I never really sort of rose above mid-tier. I always did well, but I never sort of. There was one I came close to winning, but I ended up being like third, I think. It's too many years in the past.
Would it surprise you to learn that I actually won a Halo tournament once?
No, tell me about it.
Yeah, so it was Halo 2, and it was while I was in Bible school. So right after high school. I think I was like 19 or 18 or 19. And it was a Halo 2 tournament at like a local coffee shop. So it wasn't that big of a deal. There weren't that many people who actually came to it. But I played, and I think I won a doubles tournament. And I lost the singles because, man, this guy... He camped with a noob combo. You know what I'm talking about? Like the plasma.
And the BR.
The plasma. What is it called? The plasma
pistol.
Mm-hmm. And the BR. Yeah. And he just like, he camped and would just like, I'd be running around looking for him. Because I could beat him in a gunfight, but I couldn't compete with him like camping and having a noob combo.
Yeah.
So that really made me mad actually. Yeah. But we did win the doubles tournament, so that was satisfying. And I think it was against the same guy, like him and someone else.
Yeah. The biggest regret of my life was at the end of high school, Halo 3. I was the best, but my guy who I did doubles with went to the school just in the north, so I couldn't play with him. So I grabbed one other guy. He did absolutely awful, and we lost by 1.
Ooh.
He got -6, I was +7. Or sorry, no, he got -7, I was +6. So we ended up being -1, and they beat us by 1.
Oh,
but I was basically soloing it that whole game. But it was 49-50.
Were you frustrated?
I was, but he was.
Did video games like frustrate you in general?
Yeah, I wasn't frustrated at that point because it was him or nothing, and so I knew he knew he wasn't as good. But
yeah,
he kind of came in to sort of just so I had someone to go with.
I just think this is so cool. Like we were talking last night about like theology. I feel like this microphone is still in my neck. I'll try to get it out of here. We were talking about like theology and all these other things. Oh, Catholicism. We'll get to that topic as well in just a little bit here. But we were talking about all these things, and then I learned that you play these video games that I play, and I'm like, okay, now our friendship just like immediately went to the next level. Like we have to go play. We have to like talk about Halo and stuff. So that was just really cool. Is there anything that video game wise that you think I should know before we move on to another topic?
Yeah, I'll see you online. Halo Infinite in December.
Oh yes. Halo Infinite. December what?
I think. I think December 8th.
Okay.
Check that out. It's somewhere around then.
So well, the when this video actually comes out, like it's going to be probably way past December 8th.
Fair enough.
When it actually comes out, it's probably going to be before December 8th. But then most of the people that watch it are going to watch it after December 8th. So
fair enough.
It's not that big of a deal for the purpose of this video. Okay, so let's switch gears. We'll get back to apologetics. We'll get to theology and science and all the good stuff. So, but let's start with, let's just go straight to it, Catholicism. So you're a Protestant, but you've done some study into Catholicism, right? And
Right.
so you last night you were telling me, similar to me in my situation, your wife is scared that you're going to become Catholic.
She is terrified of it.
Is she okay with you saying that on camera?
I'm sure she is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. She's terrified of it, and why is that?
Well, it's because the two main people who I'm focusing on my PhD, just to sort of target a couple individuals, are both Catholic individuals.
Okay.
One's Théo de Chardin, and the other one is Thomas Aquinas. One was a Dominican, and one was a Jesuit. So very, very much soaked in Catholic theology. I love going to Mass. I do
too.
I do, yeah. Isn't it wonderful?
Mass, it's beautiful. And even the Eucharist, even though I put out a video where I was arguing against the real presence view, it's still just a beautiful ceremony to me. And Mass in general is just awesome.
Yeah, this is why.
And the churches themselves are beautiful.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Most of them are. Yeah. Especially when you go to Europe.
Yes, and that's honestly, so that's why I'm Anglican. I love, and I feel no sort of pressure to leave Anglicanism because it has most of those things. You have the beautiful churches, you have you have the liturgy, you have all this sort of high church feel, which I really appreciate. But it doesn't have the questionable theological assumptions.
Which we're going to get to those in just a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to be completely frank, despite my wife's worry, I probably would become Orthodox prior to becoming Catholic.
Okay. Would she be okay with that or no?
No, still would not be okay with that.
Still not would be
a
okay.
little bit better, I think.
Why? Why is that better than Catholicism?
I think there's a little bit of angst because she grew up in a pretty Southern Baptist family with anything associated with Catholicism.
Okay. And so most people don't even know that Orthodox is a thing.
Yeah. Most
Christians in the U.S.
It's a tiny little minority church that most people only know through hearsay. They've heard of it, but they haven't.
There's a beautiful Orthodox church by my old house, and I drove by it and I was like, "What kind of building is this? What?" And then I read on the sign one day it was like an Orthodox Christian church, and I was like, "That's pretty cool."
I drove past 2 Coptic Orthodox churches on the way here. I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
Wow.
Which I was shocked to see.
I kind of want to go see them now.
Yeah.
You got to let me know where they are after we finish this interview.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics about Catholic doctrine, something that kind of keeps you away from affirming Catholicism. What would you say is the number one or the top 2 or top 3 if you have to name 3? What's some of the top reasons why you're not Catholic?
Yeah, I think that the 2 most important ones are going to be doctrines of Mary, the Mariology, and the papal supremacy.
Okay.
The doctrines surrounding the Pope and Mary. I had a Protestant tell me this once, a fellow Protestant tell me this once, which is, always be careful in your theology, never to predicate of humanity what is only proper to God. And things that are God.
Sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah, seems pretty reasonable. But he said, now let's think about Catholicism. Sinlessness, Mary. Infallibility, the Pope ex cathedra. I always need to say that, ex cathedra, right? These are sorts of things that's hyperdulia, right? Even though it's different from latria.
What is hyperdulia?
So
I'm still learning all this stuff.
Yeah. So in Catholic theology, they make a separation between dulia and latria, which is dulia is a sort of veneration that you get that's proper to the saints. Latria is worship, right? But they are okay with hyperdulia for Mary, which is a sort of middle point between worship and veneration. And that's okay for Mary. And so hyperdulia, it's a sort of, and to me, quite often, I like the distinction. I'm glad they're making the distinction.
Yeah, it's important.
But it often in practice, at least in my own experience, the terminological distinction isn't strong enough to actually prevent some pretty close to doctrinally inappropriate actions.
So it sounds like this first objection, or as it relates to the Marian doctrines, is that this first one is we're attributing divine properties to a human, and that's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's apart from whether or not the Bible actually affirms any of these doctrines.
Yeah, and the sinlessness of Mary, it's not something original, it's not something that historically Catholics have always affirmed, right? You read Thomas Aquinas, and he thought that Mary carried original sin. And Yeah, it's something that's developed, right? Catholics believe, like we talked about, that they were there in seed form, but these were
they use that analogy of like there's a lot of these doctrines that were there in seed form, and then they blossomed later on into like the full doctrine that we see now.
Right, which is interesting to me because it does allow for doctrinal development, which Protestants should be okay with, because the Trinity was something that developed out of hundreds of years of theological discussion. But there needs to be a place where we can say that the development has gone astray, right? And usually when
Didn't you also mention that there's like a conflict between like the development thesis, but then also just was it the magisterium, or you made some point last night that there's a conflict between that idea, the seed. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Catholics, on the one hand, it's not a pure contradiction. It is possible to reconcile these, but they do rest in tension. On the one hand, they claim to be the church that Jesus established. They trace themselves back to the original disciples. We are the Church of Jesus Christ, right? Not our founding date wasn't 1517. It wasn't with this, Henry VIII. It was founded with Jesus. Then they say, well, doctrine's developed. We've changed. We've had all this development over time, and these sort of sit in tension with each other, right? To be the church that Jesus built, and yet to have completely changed, to shifted entirely from that. That's a tension there, right? Because now all of a sudden the things that the original church was teaching are going to be highly different from what the modern day Catholic Church teaches.
Yeah, that's the question, whether or not the actual teachings of the early church was different than what it teaches now.
Yeah.
Because you can say that it's there in seed form, but if it contradicts what's there, then, if the seed that you think is there contradicts what actually is there, then that's where the issue is.
And the seeds there are normally, for instance, let's talk about the Pope, for instance.
Okay.
The Pope as the head of the church, the vicar of Christ. These sorts of ways of describing the Pope. Interesting, are they there do we see that originating in first and second century church? It's very difficult to see. You read like Ignatius, some of these apostolic fathers, Clement of Rome, and that just doesn't, Clement of Rome being a bishop of Rome, being an early pope, extremely early pope, and it doesn't seem to be there. It doesn't seem, you get a couple hundred years later and you begin to see the doctrine develop. But the Eastern Church never accepted that, which is what eventuated the split from the Eastern Church. So saying that it was there in seed form, right? But now it's become so central, the papal supremacy, the Pope is the head of the church, so central to the church. What you've done is you've created a doctrine that's so distinct from how the original church operated. It's caused not one, but two different church splits. So that's where I see a lot of this tension coming from, is we're the Church of Jesus Christ, but we've developed into something that's very alien to what the church looked like in 30 or 33 AD.
Right. I noticed that in my study of the Eucharist, is that the early church looked at it more as a meal, and how now it's transformed into this whole ceremony. You've got to like do all these little things right, and back then it was just like everybody just kind of got together, and some of the early church fathers were like, hey, look, you guys are getting drunk at these parties. Like that's not what it's about. It's about it's about this memorial to Jesus and like what he did for us and stuff. And so I think that's just another point where it's different. What the early church looked like, it's a whole lot different than what it looks now.
Yeah, I do keep an open view on the Eucharist. I really like.
Well, you're Anglican.
Yeah, it's true. I can do whatever I want as an Anglican, I suppose. I do try to keep an open view on that. But on that point, you are right. When you do read Tertullian, when you do read Irenaeus, when you do read some of these early church fathers, it does seem like that there did believe in a sense of a real presence, but it's not the idea of transubstantiation, which is I don't think it's, could be corrected. I don't think it's real doctrine, like official doctrine of the Catholic Church, but it's sort of presumed doctrine of transubstantiation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of like a married priests. It's not officially forbidden. There are a few married priests, but it's not going to happen. You're not going to get a married pope. It's one of those things that's sort of, it's traditional, but it's not like set in stone.
Yeah. So Marian doctrine, papal, what did you call it? You had some specific name for it.
I call it papal supremacy.
Papal supremacy.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of the two main ones. But you also mentioned, I think last night, that like there's some specific things that you have some like issue with. Is that right, or am I remembering that wrong?
Maybe. I'm trying to remember.
Because we talked about like the doctrine of hell. I don't know if that was one.
Yeah. So the idea of hell, we did get into that, whether annihilationism.
Oh yes, because you were talking about. It's jogging my memory now. How it was the classical theist thing, right? It's like how it seems to fit better. Classical theism seems to fit better with annihilationism.
Right. Yeah.
Explain that.
Yeah, so I don't come to any view on hell, any firm view, but I will say that it has come to my attention that annihilationism does seem to be the best fit with classical theism, simply because to be separated from God, as Thessalonians tells us, it's cast out, we are separated from God. That's the description of hell. So it is biblical description. But if God is being, God is the font of being itself, being, SAS ipsum, yeah. Then to be separated from God is to be separated from being, ergo non-being, which is annihilation. So that does seem as a more natural fit. And honestly, it did have some early proponents. I am of the conviction that Athanasius at some point held to it, and he's considered the father of orthodoxy. His very descriptions on the Incarnation very much allude to the fact that Jesus came to save us from annihilation, from passing into non-being. We as image bearers, God could not bear the thought of us passing into non-being. Therefore, he sent Christ to save us. So the idea of annihilationism at least has a root as far back, as a tradition goes in Christianity.
Well, we can't go this entire interview. I'm going to switch gears again. We can't go this entire interview without talking about reincarnation and how we actually met. Well, we didn't meet at this point, but I watched a video from you. It was a debate on Theology Unleashed, which we're planning another debate between you and Arjuna of coming up soon, actually. Right. So very soon. So be on the lookout for that. But I noticed that you did this debate on reincarnation, and I just remember thinking that this guy's like someone that I want to be connected with. He's got the sort of philosophical and theological chops, and he was also like coming at this debate in like the right way, like the Christ-like way. And so that's what really stuck out to me, and I wanted to reach out to you just on that basis and be like, let's figure out what's going on with this guy. And so that's kind of how we like I'm calling it a friendship, but that's how our friendship like kind of started. But also like tell the audience about like how crazy that was, that when I reached out to you about reincarnation and like the timing of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the timing of that it could not have been more perfect. As it happens, so I work part-time at a job where I do a lot of book reviews, where I basically create synopses and do research for a company that kind of is creating something similar to Blinkist, if you know what that app is. Book summaries, book reviews, and they wanted to do a whole section in like a bunch of books on reincarnation. Quite a few of them, in fact, and some of them were scientific studies in reincarnation. And literally the day prior to, I think it was just a day prior to you calling and asking if I wanted to do this, those books had arrived, and I was just going to start doing an extensive research on this, on something completely unrelated to the topic of reincarnation and the evidence for reincarnation. And lo and behold, I get a call from Cameron saying, hey, do you want to do a debate on the evidence for reincarnation? And I had to bite my lip because I thought, if God's ever going to, directly speak to me, it's probably going to be right now. Like, it's going to look exactly like this, And so I was like, yeah, that sounds like something I could probably do.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought that was crazy how like the timing of it was so perfect, and you're like starting to do your research on this really interesting topic, which it really, like, listening to that debate, and I also watched the debate between Arjuna and Tom Jump and I think G-Man, and that one was pretty entertaining for a lot of reasons. But I remember listening to Arjuna like make his case, right, for him and the other guy, and there's all of these scientific studies on reincarnation, especially like, these young children who have these experiences or say that they have these past memories, these past life memories. And there's a whole bunch of research on this. I think, what were you telling me one day, that like the research, like just to scratch the surface, would just be like mind-blowing.
Enormous. 3 bookshelves full of just research.
Yeah.
Yeah. One researcher counted it up. That's not good research. That's just research in general.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the job of somebody who wants to get into that to figure out the good stuff. But even the good stuff will take up about 1 full bookshelf of just studies, scientific studies on this.
Wow. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So what is kind of like the argument for, reincarnation? What does that actually look like? And then what are not to give away like, your whole strategy in this debate, but like what are some of the reasons why you're kind of skeptical of the argument that's made there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's many different ways that scientists or researchers, because not all of them are scientists, have tried to sort of get at this. Some do hypnotic regression.
Okay.
Ask people to go into hypnosis, tell us about a past life, write down the details, and try and confirm that. Now, why that's not normally scientifically accepted is because you can never rule out this person got this information in some other way, subconsciously stored it, and then is saying this in this hypnotic regression. And there's similar studies done with people who don't have hypnotic regression. They just say they know these facts. You can never rule out the fact that this could be obtained some other way. The studies that are of most interest are the ones that Arjuna and I will be talking about. And they come from the University of Virginia, a guy who passed away recently, Ian Stevenson, and his successor, Jim Tucker. And they decided they needed to rule this out. So they only did studies on children, normally before the age of 5, because that reduces the amount of time that these kids could have to acquire this information. Normally kids that age, they barely remember anything at all, let alone highly detailed facts about past lives, people's names, addresses, and stuff like that. And just narrowing it into that, they had some real interesting things. So for instance, they have cases where kids have birthmarks that correlate with the wounds of the person who they claim they died. They have facts that they were able to recognize spouses and name them, and children and friends with families that lived miles away, because they claim to be the person who they claim to be, their spouse, their children, their friends, having never met them, according to the parents, having never met them. So there's real interesting, that sort of information. Then it becomes sort of a very live option of how do we explain this? It could
that
be
already, the way that you explained that just now, like already has me like opened up to the possibility of reincarnation. Yeah,
and they are very interesting it's a very interesting topic, and some of the cases are shocking, are absolutely shocking. I am very, very skeptical, as are quite a few other researchers. For some researchers, that has opened them up to it. For other researchers are skeptical, and I think they're skeptical for good reasons. And I won't give all the details, but number one is the fact that quite often this comes years later, sometimes up to 10 to 15 years later.
What do you mean?
So the testimony from the parents or from the kids will come years later. Okay,
so like they'll say, 10 years later that the kid at the age of 3 or 4 was saying all these things.
Right.
Okay.
So 10 years later, like memories from 10 years in the past are going to get distorted, especially monumental, exaggerated events.
Yeah.
Right. Exaggeration can easily creep in. Number two, virtually all of these come from cultures or families that already believed in reincarnation. So there comes this
kind of primed.
Yeah, they're primed for it, and there's this idea that the parents might have been encouraging this, the culture might have been encouraging this. So they say, "Can you identify your spouse?" One of these things is they'll take a child and say, who claims to be this other person, say, "Can you identify your spouse?" And they'll all be subtly looking at the spouse, waiting for the kid to identify the person. So the kid, all he has to do is locate the eyes, and just by the power of subconscious suggestion is able to identify the spouse or the kids. And in these cultures, they don't realize it's going on, but this is well known in psychology that this happens all the time, this subtle power of suggestion. And you're able to sort of have these amazingly confirmed facts, and then 10 years down the road, you're not able to figure that out.
What about the birthmarks, and then also remembering like the names of the children and stuff?
Yeah. So when you actually get into the actual details of that, quite often the names are not exact. They'll say like Marie, and it'll be like Maria, but Ian Stevenson will still count that as a near hit, or he'll only count the names that they get right, and he'll leave out the names they get wrong. And if you actually get into the very details, it doesn't often make it into the books itself, but he does point you to it. When you look at the details, you'll notice the kids get a lot of misses as well. And the birthmarks, so for instance, in one famous case, it did correspond according to the parents, but when Stevenson got there, he reported the birthmark had apparently moved. So not all of these are quite as amazing as they come out when you first hear them.
Yeah.
And there's also the sense that there's been other researchers who've said it's because the birthmarks correspond to the wounds of a person people know are dead, that they'll begin suggesting to the child, you might be the reincarnation of this person. They're mentally associating them with that person and therefore priming the child to begin to think of themselves in that way.
Yeah, it's a good response. There's some good skepticism right there.
And that's going to be line 1. Line 1 is the evidence.
That's only one.
Line 2, here's the thing though. Let's assume all this evidence is good, right?
Okay.
Does this show reincarnation? Unfortunately, for people who support reincarnation, there are quite a few other people who use the exact same evidence to confirm theories that have nothing to do with reincarnation, but equally explain the evidence. And I'll get into that into debate because there's quite a few of these.
Okay.
But the whole point is we might think this might be reincarnation, but how do we know that that's the best explanation for the given evidence? The evidence itself doesn't demand reincarnation. There's plenty of other explanations. As soon as we're allowing these sort of supernatural explanations in, there's plenty of other explanations that other scientists, other researchers have taken this and said, look, it confirms what I say.
Yeah, I just want to sit here and think about that for a while. That's really good. I mean, well, yeah, there's other possible explanations on the horizon that you could look at, the set of different possible explanations that could explain the data.
You want me to give just one example?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so for instance, there is a biologist out of Cambridge. His name is Rupert Sheldrake.
Okay.
He's a bit of a maverick within the biological community, but he's got this idea called morphic resonance, which is this idea that memory is a sort of fundamental feature of the universe. And he uses this to explain migration patterns for creatures that have never migrated. He uses this to explain developmental patterns, because development right now in creatures is a bit mysterious. He uses this to explain a lot of things. When Stevenson's work came out, that children are remembering things from other individuals, he trumpeted it as evidence for morphic resonance. And the reason he gave for it is because similar structures, his idea is that similar structures will cause the remembering of similar things. So if a child has a similar brain structure to a past person, it will provoke the same memory. It's not that that person is the same person, but that similar structures provoke the same memory. So the child will have the memory even though they aren't that person. And this is how he explains migration patterns, which are quite a few are completely mysterious. Monarch butterflies, when they're born, they never complete the migration pattern. They know when they're born where they're at on the migration pattern. And his idea is because they share the same structure as the other monarch butterflies, they're inheriting that memory, that sort of social memory from the species. And he thinks the same thing explains it in humanity. Now, I'm not saying I believe that or I buy into that, but as far as evidence goes, there's a lot more that idea explains than reincarnation. So the explanatory scope of morphic resonance, Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance, is far greater than reincarnation is. So just on a scale of which should we prefer, from an explanatory perspective, morphic resonance is superior. And that's just one. There's many other ideas. So when you begin to add all of these up together, reincarnation, the likelihood of reincarnation becomes diminishingly small.
Because you have these other competing theories that are actually good competing theories.
Good competing theories that are as good or better at explaining the same evidence.
So that makes me think about something related to the argument that a lot of theologians and New Testament scholars and apologists will give in favor of Christianity. Is like, you've got these historical facts, and like, how do we best explain these facts? So, and not just the resurrection, because that's just one example of a miracle, but what about other miracles, like contemporary miracles? Like, couldn't we do the same line? Like, couldn't we explain away certain features of the miracle story, and then also look at competing theories, competing explanations that seem just as good, if not better, than the miracle account? So it seems like the skepticism you're applying to the reincarnation could also be applied to the resurrection, could be applied to contemporary miracle stories. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, easy enough. I mean, the easiest response to that would be, number one, look at the evidence for the resurrection. Are there comparable modern-day miracles? Number two, I think, and this is a big one, if it is the same, then could we not admit modern-day miracles? I'm perfectly fine with that, because I do believe in a sort of enchanted cosmos. I believe that there is more to this.
I like that term, enchanted cosmos.
It's not my own, unfortunately. But I do believe in that. I do believe that there is much more mysterious to the world is much more mysterious than we give it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm perfectly content with that if that's where the evidence leads. I feel like that's a far more open-minded approach than this Humean idea that miracles are always the least likely explanation. And there's multiple reasons, obviously, for that. There's a deep philosophical debate, but I'm much more okay with that.
So the response is kind of just like, okay, well, you've still got to do like the research and look into it and like actually look at the details of the miracle stories and apply skepticism like equally, you know? And then if it comes out to where the skepticism that you apply means that you don't believe that the miracle actually occurred, then so be it.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like a situation where, yeah, it does seem like it could apply in these cases, but you've still got to do the work of like actually, you know, trying to apply the skepticism, learning about the cases, and you gotta get your hands dirty. Is that the term?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just evidential. That's just consistency when it comes to the method that you use, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think when it comes to the reincarnation debate, either we take a hyper-skeptical approach, which you could do, and say, you know, talk about the distance, talk about the problems with it and stuff like that. That's a very hyper-skeptical approach. Or you could take a far less skeptical approach, give Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker the benefit of the doubt, and still say, nevertheless, reincarnation is the least likely of many of these hypotheses. So just given the probabilities, if we make each one equiprobable, it's still extremely unlikely that reincarnation is the best explanation.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Arjuna would want to come back on that, right?
Of course he will.
He's going to say, he's going to want to inflate the prior probability of reincarnation, I'm sure, and also say that it's a better explanation for various reasons. But I'm really looking forward to that exchange between the two of you. I didn't plan on actually getting too deep into the reincarnation stuff today, but I'm happy that you entertained me on that. Why don't we just talk about just science and faith kind of more generally? Okay, so like what other things are you kind of working on or that you're interested in along those lines? Is there something? Oh yeah, there is something that you're currently working on, right? That we haven't talked about. Like what's coming down the line here, or is that the evolution bit being still evidence for theism? Isn't that what you're currently working on?
Yeah, that's what I'm currently working on.
Okay, I don't think we've talked about that. We've talked about it a little bit.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll just talk about it in more detail now.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll get little tidbits of that on the CC blog. So another pitch for the CC blog. But what I'm looking at specifically, I think I've mentioned adaptations, right? Adaptations are adapted for. Evolution itself is built in with these latent teleological concepts, adaptation being one. Another one would be the concept of fitness. Fitness, I think my favorite definition in biology is the one given for fitness. And you can find that, I love this source. It defines fitness as something every biologist knows, but no one can properly define.
Okay.
Fitness is, and it's an important concept because we talked about survival of the fittest, right? Uh-huh. Fitness gradations is something that factors into into the mathematics of population genetics. They assign fitness variations to different genotypes and to different phenotypes of creatures. And
would it just be like ability to survive?
The ability to survive, not really, because then a creature can survive quite well, right? But if it doesn't leave any offspring, it has very low fitness. Its fitness would be zero.
Ability to survive and reproduce.
Ability to survive and reproduce. How do you factor those two out? Because those are two different things there, right? And here's another thing, right? The ability to survive and reproduce. So in biology, so suppose a super fit creature, a creature that in all super fit, yeah, big, strong,
kind of like you.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone who looks at me thinks
I mean, you did say this morning while we got donuts that you work out 3 times a week. So
I try to. Yeah. No. So with fitness, so let's say
we're talking about fitness. This is
it can be all distracted.
Yeah.
Being a gym buff, no one would be able to tell. So it doesn't pay off. But let's take a perfectly fit creature, right? And let's just say he's great. It's a herbivore grazing at the bottom of a mountain. avalanche happens, kills the creature. Less fit creature survives and reproduces, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, which creature was more fit?
Yeah, the other one.
The one that died?
The one that died.
Right, but then we just define fitness as the ability to survive and reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
But the less fit one.
Mm-hmm.
So it can't be the ability to survive and reproduce, right?
Yeah, you'd probably have to. What I would do then is just make it sort of counterfactual. So like barring these other, circumstances that could kill it.
Yeah,
These unnatural circumstances that could just happen, like meteorites coming and like you wouldn't want to say that the dinosaurs were unfit because some meteor came and killed them.
I think you said the key term there, unnatural, right? We need to have some sort of idea that there's a nature that a creature has, right?
Mm-hmm.
It fits within a certain environment. Fit, keyword there. But what do we mean by fit? What is that like? They're not puzzle pieces fitting together. What we're talking about is we're talking about the features that we consider essential to the creature and how they operate within an environment that they're adapted for. There's an arrow pointing towards it.
I was thinking about the nature of the thing itself, the animal itself, plus the environment that it's in. Has got to be well suited for the thing.
Right.
In order for you've got to tie in these sort of external factors into the fitness of. That's interesting.
Yeah, and what you're to end up doing is you're saying the factors that you're tying in are the purposeful factors, right?
That does sound like it. Like the environment, you've got to say that the environment was sort of well suited, and that term well suited, I think, would lend itself toward like teleology. You like trying to even talk about it, right? Right.
We can't get around these teleological concepts, and trust me, biologists have tried for so long. This is why they leave fitness undefined, because as soon as they try to define it, they reintroduce the very mystical teleology that science has been trying to get rid of biology this whole time. That's why that's been a huge issue. And there's been a lot of things like propensity interpretations, all these sorts of ideas to try and sort of wiggle their way out of it. And they've all been universal failures. So within fitness studies, it's pretty well acknowledged that so far the job has been pretty hopeless. And I firmly, like part of my PhD project, and a whole chapter is devoted is to show that is because it's an attempt to avoid teleology and a failure to do so. Because biology, the concept of survival of the fittest within Darwinism is a teleological concept.
Yeah, and I want to like kind of make sure that the audience understands that this is not an argument against evolution.
No, it's an argument for the truth of evolution based on theism. Because I do believe that teleology is not explicable except in the light of theism.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that the audience was aware that, because that can be a kind of like, typically these design arguments as it relates to evolution are put in like, the intelligent design movement. I think we mentioned this earlier. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we should have probably started with this, but it's a good end cap as well. This conversation is just super fascinating to me.
Considering that most of what I've written on the blog has been a defense of Darwinian evolution, especially its compatibility. I hope people are hearing me as saying, I consider it an ally. I'm part of a growing number of scholars who considers evolutionary theory an ally to the theist. And
it doesn't take away from it, but it's also, we're not rejecting evolution at this point. We're saying that evolution, and there was a really good analogy that Rope gave in the interview that I did with him and Zachary Ardern, which was about the car factory, right, that builds all of these cars. And it's a sort of automated process. Nevertheless, it does that whole process points to design, like even though it's an automated process.
Yeah, it's an analogy. I can't remember. There's a physicist who used it, right? Which is Dawkins says Dawkins is like a person who walks in and finds an automatic like watch factory or car factory building watches automatically and says, "See, I've shown that there is no design," and all he's done is create a bigger design issue. Right, and that's Rope's argument. Rope and I have talked about that because we're hitting this at two sort of complementary and different angles, right?
Okay.
But I think
so make the distinction for me then. How is your argument different from his?
So Rope's argument is based on the idea of design, essentially. I don't get into design, is the thing. I ask the question of purposes, right?
Okay.
So for him, it will still be this idea.
See, I think that those are like tied in together, like teleology and design. How are they not?
So the one with design, it's based on an intuition of a sort of, it might not be a specified complexity, not in the sort of the William Dembski sense, but it is this idea that the parts is so complex, it's so intricate, and it's aimed at a purpose. that all of these coming together demands an intelligence, demands some sort of design inference. That's where he's getting at. But for me, I don't need necessarily, my argument, it's a little bit more primordial, I would say, a little bit more, it doesn't require certain assumptions. In that case, it's less scientific, it's less powerful, I think, but it's also harder to attack, I think. That's why I see these as complementary streams. And it's this idea, so for instance, you don't need complexity in this. A rock can have a purpose. If I came in here and I saw you had a bunch of papers and a rock sitting on top of it,
okay,
I would infer a purpose in that rock, right? And it's not from the complexity or anything like that. It's just from recognizing a purposeful end in it. There's some sort of end goal being reached, right? There's no appeal to complexity. There's no appeal to intricate design or anything like that. It's just the goal.
Yeah, I see the distinction now.
Right. And that's the thing, that natural processes, at least on given scientific assumptions, don't have goals or ends. So something else has to be introduced if natural processes do have goals or ends. And it's that sort of very simple, immediate intuition of seeing goals and ends within life forms that I'm getting at.
Okay. I see it now, but I'm kind of unsure where to go from here. How would you tie this in then to theism? Maybe this is a good way to sort of wrap it up. How would you say that theism is like the better explanation? Because just like in the case of the reincarnation example, like you've got reincarnation as one of the hypotheses, but you could say that there was some kind of design put in place by, like, say, some alien civilization had, some design, some end goal that they wanted to achieve with biological complexity or adaptation or whatever, right? So it's not that theism is the only explanation on offer. We've got some others that we've got to entertain and sort of rule out if we want to say that theism is the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Rope, you could maybe throw in, or any sort of ID, you could always have aliens, right? Yeah. With mine, you can't, because it's metaphysical, right?
Explain that.
It's metaphysical in the sense that atoms clinking together, a purpose doesn't sort of arise out of that. And no matter how many atoms you combine together, you don't get a purpose, right? No end goal sort of magically appears out of that. For that, you need a mind. Minds give purposes. Minds give ends. That's the distinctive feature of a mind, is that they have final causes. Whereas, with matter, it's mostly efficient causes. I'm using Aristotle's four causes. Is that okay? So that's a distinctive feature of mind. So for instance, a mindless robot might not have goals and purposes except what its designer gave to it, right? Even if it does the exact same action, say it got a cup of coffee. But if I were to get a cup of coffee, you would know that I had a final cause, right? And it's because I have that mental intention within me, right? And that's why it's metaphysical. So if aliens came for the purpose of creating life on Earth, there's still that sort of mental intentionality built into that, right?
Okay.
So that's why it's metaphysical. There is no appealing to other intelligences, because you still have to explain that seemingly mental content, right?
Okay.
That's why it's a bit more primordial, a bit more simple, but it's also less scientific, and I think that it loses some appeal in that case, but it gains in strength of, you can't appeal to like aliens or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that you and Josh Rasmussen, you know Josh Rasmussen?
I do know
okay.
Josh Rasmussen.
Okay, yeah, I think you and him would be best friends on this. Like, that's what he's currently working on. Yeah.
Alex Proust is also working on, this is by pure accident, he's also working on an argument very similar to mine.
Wow.
And I knew this just because I brought it up to him, and this is what, at some lectures at Oxford, he talked about it. So when
was it recent?
Yeah, I'll send you the link. I can send you the link. I can't remember the name of the lectures. Yeah.
Sounds cool. Okay, I mean, I feel like we could talk for a whole lot longer, but I feel like this is a good place to stop for now. Right, because we're not ending the conversation completely. He's going to be doing more of the blog. He's going to be probably doing more interviews with us. So thanks for coming on, though.
Yeah.
It's been awesome.
It's been great.
Should I shake your hand?
I'll shake your hand.
Yeah,
we washed. We're COVID clean.
And we definitely will after this as well. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think about this new setup. I'm actually using a GoPro for this wide angle camera, so I'm not too sure how I'm going to like it, but let me know what you think about this format. Let me know what you think about the content, and I will see you guys in the next video. So see you later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like, you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it.
That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?